Hello there, welcome to the channel. Today we are discussing a once only encountered vessel by the USS Voyager in the Delta Quadrant. A species that we know were actually encountered by the Borg, but we don't have any named, even a Borg designation for them. We say we only know the Borg encountered them because one of them was seen when 7 of 9 got exposed to a Borg vinculum and a whole thing, and we saw loads of different assimilated species. But Voyager's encounter with them was a little bit more confusing as to whether or not the species are hostile, peaceful, or whatever the hell's going on. They seem a fairly peculiar race, and they are simply known as the Repto-Humanoid species. So to get the obligatory part out of the way, please like, share, and subscribe. It all helps the channel grow, and leave your thoughts in the comment section about this race down below. And today, specifically, we're going to talk about their starship. It's actually a kit bash of a vessel, and I know, Star Trek kit bashing something? Never. It was a reuse of the Vidian model with a sort of extra bit added on the rear of the starship. And the rear of the starship's actually oddly relevant to this story, but let's give a little background. We don't know much about the species. As I said, we do know they're encountered by the Borg. They were encountered by the USS Voyager on their travels in 2372. The starship is estimated to be around 500 meters in length. Scaling is always a thing, although an element of perspective in space is sometimes what my excuse is for why things look bigger or smaller, because a few hundred or a few thousand kilometers in space can actually not look that far depending on how big the ship is. The vessel itself is a relatively flat profile. As I said, it is a redress of a Vidian design with just a few added extra things on it. It's a relatively flat starship with a wide profile ventrally and dorsally to the ship, and is armed with at least particle cannons that are equal to those of Voyager. Not known if it carries torpedoes, and has reasonably good but inferior shielding compared to Voyager. The species are not known to have transporters or any other advanced technologies, but it is interesting that their combat technologies seem to be at least coming close to a par with a Federation starship, although again, Voyager is only 2/3 the size of the ship and seems to equal it in combat capability, which means one of two things. Either their tactical systems are so less advanced in Starfleet they need more of them to kind of come close, or this isn't a particularly hostile species, and despite the size of the ship, it's not as well armed as it potentially could be if we were talking about a Klingon ship or even a Starfleet vessel. The exact capabilities of the ship are unknown. It is warp and impulse capable. It is crewed by a reptilian species that we do not know the name of, and know relatively little else about them. For example, language, as they refuse to answer hails or communicate. And when one was encountered on the surface, all it kind of did was kind of roar at Lieutenant Paris and Mr. Neelix. The unusual circumstances upon encountering the ship are also a bit peculiar. Voyager was running a little low on supplies. Their long-range sensors detected what might be an M-class world, but due to EM interference and other such things in the atmosphere, they couldn't get a good reading on it. The determination was that it's a proto-Earth sort of world, a planet relatively still early in its evolution, but does have a breathable atmosphere. There may or may not be extensive plant and animal life on the surface. One of the things that indicates a large amount of flora and fauna, or potentially large amounts of them, was the presence of amino acids in the planetary atmosphere. And although the sensors couldn't penetrate the atmosphere due to the EM interference, the presence of amino acids was a good, strong indicator of life. And the planet did actually have life. There was plant life down on the surface, but there was no indication of any animal life. So, plenty of flora, not much fauna going on down there. But they did only arrive at one particular part of the planet. For all we know, the opposite side of the world could have been covered in lush rainforests. It's not likely. There could have also been life in the oceans of the planet, which it must have had. There seemed to be some kind of cycling of the atmosphere, and there was a lot of oxygen. There must have been something, at least plant life was cycling it, and most likely for that would be oceans. They couldn't transport through this atmosphere either, and communication was also a problem. So they sent a shuttle down, but due to turbulence, EM interference, and other such things, the shuttle's engines got clogged up and ultimately crashed. That's when the alien ship turned up and caused Voyager some trouble, opening fire immediately but refusing to answer hails. Down on the surface, Paris and Neelix would find a clutch of eggs, one of which hatched near immediately, which is why the alien ship was likely on its way back. The thing that stands out to me is they do make some suppositions about the species. Scanning the baby as it emerges from the egg, they realize it's humanoid due to the skeletal structure, but reptilian, being cold-blooded and having external reptilian features. It feeds on the vapors on the planet. One of the issues with the world is when they got down there, there was a considerable amount of toxic vapors down on the surface. These trigemic vapors were strongly advised by the ship's doctor that they should limit skin exposure to them. Me, I would have taken hazmat suits. But they are only an irritant, not actually a problem. They're not toxic in and of themselves. They're just more of an irritant and cause some welts on the skin. Other than that, they were relatively harmless. They weren't going to kill you. So it was more a limit your exposure rather than be too worried about it. But it turns out that these nucleotides and vapors in the atmosphere are actually what the infant fed upon, which is why the parents had laid the eggs there, which is opens up a lot of questions to me. It's like, were there many eggs on this world? Why did they leave the eggs on it? Did they have to? Were they pregnant and they had to leave them there? Were they on a dangerous mission so they could want them aboard the ship? Why not just put them in a room on the ship, keep them in their quarters until they hatched? So many questions. But all the same, we do know that many species, like such as the Zindi insectoids and things, do have to have hatcheries aboard their ships because their species reproduce so rapidly and so often that it was just a necessity. It could be a similar thing with this race, but I am making an assumption. It's a bit odd, in my opinion, that they left the eggs on the planet unprotected, unguarded. Yes, the planet a little hard to get to, but still it's a little bit of a strange decision, which actually caused Paris to question, with many reptiles abandoning their young, were these eggs simply abandoned? Would the mother reject them if she returned, as Neelix thought, as disturbing the nest sometimes makes them rejected? Me personally, I'm thinking, well, this is a sentient species. Even the Gorn don't abandon their young. So yeah, she's not going to abandon the nest, most likely, but it is a little weird that they abandoned the nest, in a sense, on the planet in the first place, which did, as I said, open up a few questions for me. Going back to the starship, Voyager was having to deal with it in orbit. As I said, it was about a 500-meter long ship. It was well armed, but one of the weaknesses, despite the fact that the energy weapons seemed to be on a par with Starfleet phasers, when they redirected power to the aft weaponry, it depleted the rear shielding on the ship, something Voyager was able to detect. And when Voyager forced the vessel to engage it, Voyager deliberately pulled itself to the rear of the ship so that they would use their aft weaponry, using their small size to maneuver around it. This caused the aliens to redirect more power to their aft weapons to fire, which opened up a gap in their shields. Voyager was able to exploit, fire through, and incapacitate and knock out their weapons grid. They were not able to restore the weapons grid, so they simply entered the planetary atmosphere and landed on the surface. And then at least one of them disembarked the ship to go retrieve the young, finding the young had already been taken out of the nest, wrapped up in blankets to keep warm, and Neelix and Paris were there, hiding behind a rock, holding their phasers, just in case she decided to attack. But as far as I could tell, she wasn't even armed, assuming she was the mother and she was a she. I'm making an assumption there, but chances were. They then beam out, everything's happy, the ship is left down on the planet's surface. In summary of the starship, which I think was a very cool, easy reuse, just repaint it, add a little bit extra on. There's nothing wrong with a bit of good kit bashing. I find the ship kind of interesting, and it was another example of not necessarily something that needed to be explored, but something I would have liked to have seen a little explanation. I like some answers to the questions as to why they leave their young on this planet in the first place. What were their actual technological capabilities, seeing that some of their weapons and other technologies seemingly were equal to those of Starfleet? Just a few questions that it opened up. Were they a hostile species or weren't they a hostile species? Because they did attack initially, but they didn't pursue the violence, and their ship, despite its size, could have been better armed. What do you guys think? Let me know in the comment section down below. If you made it all to the end of the video, thank you for watching, and bye-bye. Okay, one thing I want to go over, because I forgot to include this when I was recording this video, so hello, welcome from the editing time of this video, and that is going over the ship. Some things about the vessel that seem a little peculiar to me. First of all, it looks like it's going backwards. Now, this is obviously because it is a redress of a Vidian ship, and what was the front of the Vidian vessel is now the rear of this ship. This pod that they've added on, which is now supposed to be the front of the ship, looks, to my eyes, like it should be the rear. It's got what looks like an impulse engine, or possibly a warp engine, like a Klingon bird of prey in the center. There are two energy transfer pylons coming out of the sides of it. It looks like it's an engineering hull, while the other rest of it, because it has not as many windows, it looks like it's the machinery area of the ship, whereas the other section of the vessel has more windows and things. Now, it is possible that it still is an engineering section in this race to simply put the engineering bit at the front. These pods on either side are clearly the nacelles. They have a purple hue to them, but similar to Romulan, human vessels, whatever, you have this whole needing two warp engines to create the warp bubble effectively around the ship in most designs. There are, of course, ways around that, but in this particular instance, it looks like that's what they've got, port and starboard engines. I could say, to my eyes, it looks like it should be going the other way, but where you are currently seeing the energy beam come out, which again, green makes it look like a disruptor, but that's not a rule. Some phasers, including Starfleet phasers, depending on frequency, will appear green, such as they do occasionally from the Enterprise D. In Battles with the Borg, if you pay attention, you do see they flick the color a little bit. Where that is coming out is actually the rear of the ship, not the front. So the drive section, that energy glow at the front, which to me, again, looks like an impulse engine, is probably a deflector dish or something of that nature, most likely. And that would again imply that this is an engineering section, because if you go off Starfleet engineering, if there's any comparison, then that drive section is an engineering hull with a deflector dish, probably the warp core in it, transferring power back into the port and starboard via those energy conduction pylons, which is what I'm assuming they are, out to the warp engines that are somewhat built into the hull of the rear section of the ship. It is just something that kind of bugs me about the design, because it doesn't seem to flow as naturally the other way. It seems that it should be going this should be the rear of the ship, not the front. But that's just me on an aesthetic analysis. Of course, a brick will fly in space if you put a big enough engine on it. That's not really an issue. And, it's just, to me, to my eye, it looks that way. But I think, again, that's because it's a Vadian design that they have redressed to look like the Repto-Humanoid ship. I do still like it. I still like it. It takes away the idea that it's necessarily a hostile vessel, because traditionally ships like the Shrike and Klingon vessels, things like that, they tend to be a little more pointy, because that's implying that they're hostile. This ship, by having the bulbousy section as the front, actually takes away that. It's less pointy and more of a flat manta ray-like design. Takes away the hostile feel a little bit, implying maybe these rays aren't quite as aggressive. They're maybe just deeply xenophobic. But anyway, I forgot to include this when I was originally filming. Just a few thoughts, and more of a petty kind of, it just feels like it's going backwards to me. But that's the end of this little add-on from the editing suite. Just before I go, one little bit in the episode, not to do with the alien ship or the aliens in general. When the Doctor was explaining about the trigemic vapors would be a skin irritant and they needed to wear cream and they should limit their exposure to the planetary atmosphere, it got Janeway to asking exactly, well, how do you know anything about this mission? You're a hologram stuck in sickbay. For the Doctor to then admit that whenever the EMH is engaged, it is able to access the ship's communications to all over the ship, and he eavesdrops on their communications and has to backpedal and gets the wonderful reference of, I'm a doctor, not a voyeur. It wasn't anything relevant to the starship, so I thought I'd plunk that on the end here. Hope you enjoyed. Bye-bye.